A Swiss guard exposed the new pope, filed a report accusing him of defying centuries of Vatican tradition. But instead of punishing him, the Vatican buried the evidence. So what exactly did he witness in the shadows of Rome that they couldn't let the world see? To find out, first press that subscribe button and tell us in the comments below where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. Corporal Elias Mäder didn't smile. Not because he was unkind, but because he believed the uniform didn't permit it. 12 years in the pontifical Swiss Guard had carved Elias Mäder's posture into marble and his demeanour into something colder than discipline. Morning light caught the edge of his halberd as he stood motionless beside the bronze doors of the apostolic palace. Rain or shine, summer heat or winter frost, his face remained a perfect mask, unreadable, unwavering. New recruits whispered that Elias had ice in his veins. If he heard these whispers, he never acknowledged them. He simply continued standing, watching, guarding, a living statue draped in the distinctive blue, red and yellow uniform that had protected popes for over 5 centuries. He had served under 2 pontiffs, and only one had earned his loyalty. Pope Francis hadn't needed fanfare. His warmth had been quiet, almost invisible, unless you looked for it. Elias remembered once, during a late Easter vigil, how Francis had stopped mid-procession to whisper something to a crying altar boy. No photographers captured it. No audience applauded it. Just kindness offered and gone like a breath of incense. Elias had witnessed that moment. He had never spoken of it. That was how trust was formed. When Francis passed, Elias didn't weep, not where anyone could see. But that night, after hanging his uniform in the dark, he sat for a long time by the tiny bookshelf in his quarters. His eyes drifted to the empty space where the Pope's latest encyclical used to be. He didn't realize until later that he'd lent it to a junior guard and never gotten it back. Elias had first met Francis 7 years earlier, during a rainstorm that had emptied St. Peter's Square of tourists and pilgrims alike. Standing guard at the eastern portico, soaked to the skin despite his cape, Elias had maintained his position even as lightning split the sky above the basilica. He remembered the moment clearly. Water streaming from his helmet, boots slowly filling with rainwater, eyes fixed ahead while lesser men sought shelter. Francis had appeared suddenly, walking alone, his white cassock darkened by rain. When he spotted Elias, the Pope had stopped, genuinely surprised to find anyone still at their post in such conditions. "Even God takes shelter in a storm," Francis had said, his Argentine accent more pronounced when speaking quietly. He'd held out a simple black umbrella, not ceremonial, just practical. Elias had declined with the slightest shake of his head. "My duty, Holy Father." Francis hadn't pressed the issue. Instead, he'd simply folded the umbrella and stood beside Elias for nearly 5 minutes, letting the rain soak them both. No words passed between them. No grand gestures. Just shared discomfort, chosen freely by one man and accepted dutifully by the other. As Francis finally turned to leave, he'd said something that stayed with Elias through all the years that followed. Fidelity isn't measured by who stays dry in the storm, but by who remains standing when it passes. That moment had forged a connection between them, an unspoken understanding that transcended rank and role. It wasn't friendship exactly, something rarer, mutual recognition. On May 8th, white smoke rose above the Sistine Chapel. Elias stood in formation in the inner courtyard, straight-backed and stone-faced, while others craned their necks to guess the name. The announcement echoed from the balcony. Cardinal João Luís Santiago, now Pope Leo XIV. Elias blinked, a rare break in his composure. He knew the name. Everyone did. The barefoot cardinal from Brazil, they called him. The one who gave away his vestments to beggars and skipped formal dinners to pray in kitchens. The one who refused titles and ended speeches before they were expected to finish. A radical, wrapped in humility. But for Elias, it rang hollow. He had spent his career learning that true reverence didn't need to perform. He feared this new pope was playing to an audience, even if that audience was the poor. Grand gestures, public acts of virtue, unpredictable appearances. Elias didn't trust them. He didn't trust theatre. 3 days after the election, Commander Albrecht summoned him to an office that smelled of old leather and incense. Afternoon light slanted through half-closed blinds, catching dust motes in the air. "You'll be reassigned temporarily," Albrecht said, flipping a folder shut. "To where?" Elias kept his voice neutral. "You're not moving, just watching." "Watching who?" "The Pope." Elias raised an eyebrow, which for him was nearly insubordinate. Albrecht didn't flinch. "He's asked for flexibility in his personal movements, evening walks, garden paths. No assigned entourage. We need someone nearby, silent, discreet, no interaction, just presence." Elias said nothing. Albrecht added, "He requested someone who wasn't a fan." That gave Elias pause. The commander slid the folder across the desk. Inside was a brief itinerary. Garden patrol detail, May 12th to 17. 1 page. No commentary. "Start tomorrow," Albrecht said. "Just keep your distance and keep your eyes open." Elias nodded once, saluted, turned and left. He didn't question the assignment. That wasn't his habit. But as he walked back toward the barracks, something stirred beneath his breastplate. Not emotion, just friction. The slight resistance of duty, rubbing against conviction. It was the first time in a long while that Elias Mäder didn't feel entirely certain of where he stood. And he didn't like that feeling at all. The days after a papal election are supposed to be orderly. Transition protocols, security clearances, ceremonial rehearsals. Everything designed to bridge one pontificate into the next with reverent precision. But the days following May 8th felt off. Not disorganized, just unexpected. Elias noticed it first in the corridors. Staff walked differently, less clipped, more uncertain. Schedules arrived late. Guard rotations shifted mid-hour without explanation. Papal secretaries, usually composed and firm, seemed unsure of how to prepare a man who didn't want preparation. By the second day, word spread that Pope Leo XIV had skipped 3 scheduled orientation meetings with senior Curia members. Instead, he had spent 2 hours talking to the Vatican gardeners about soil pH and migratory birds. Not a joke. Elias overheard it firsthand from one of the garden staff while off duty. Other stories trickled in. Aides arrived at the Apostolic Palace one morning to find that Leo had rearranged all the chairs in his study, removing the grand armchairs entirely. He brought in a plain wooden bench, apparently borrowed from the nuns' laundry wing. During a briefing on inaugural security, he dismissed half the committee before they'd opened their folders, said he preferred presence to planning. Elias began recording all of it. Not officially, just in his own small black notebook. The kind issued to every guard, but rarely used beyond gear logs and discipline notes. He kept his entries sparse. Bullet points, times, locations, actions, no opinions. He didn't intend to smear the Pope. He wasn't gathering evidence for rebellion. But somewhere in him, a need to understand had taken root. The 10th note, he wrote, simply read, May 11th. Declined limousine to Vatican Gardens. Walked in rain. Refused umbrella. That one he underlined. By the 4th day, Elias had established a rhythm. Every evening between 9 and 10, Pope Leo walked the Eastern Garden perimeter alone. No security entourage, no aides, just a white cassock moving like a ghost between hedgerows and orange trees. Elias followed from a respectful distance, sometimes 10 paces, sometimes 12, always in silence. The Pope never acknowledged him. Not once, never turned around, never waved. But he knew Elias was there. Of that, Elias was certain. On the fifth night, something shifted. As Leo passed the small bench overlooking the cloister fountain, he paused. Not long, just a heartbeat. Then, without turning, he reached into his sleeve and set something gently on the bench. He walked on. Elias approached cautiously, looked around. No one. He picked up the folded square of parchment. Plain paper, no seal. Inside, in clean black ink, were 5 words. Watch closely, then decide. That was all. Elias didn't pocket the note. He returned it to the bench exactly as he found it. And then he stood there a moment longer, the lamplight catching the edges of his polished breastplate. He was not a man easily moved. But something in that moment, something quiet, unsettling, made him feel less like a guard and more like a witness. That night, in his ledger, he wrote only one line. He knows I'm not convinced. Then he closed the book. He didn't know what he was looking for yet, but now he was certain. Whatever it wasn't written in any schedule. The following night, Elias arrived at the eastern gate 10 minutes early. He didn't know why. He was never late, but tonight something felt different. Not tense exactly, but close, like a door waiting to open. The Vatican gardens were silent at dusk. Moonlight pooled beneath the olive trees. Somewhere far off, a fountain murmured behind thick hedges. The only other sound was his own breath, steady and controlled beneath his armour. At exactly 9:04 p.m., the Pope emerged from the side passage of Domus Sanctae Marthi. No guards, no announcements, no fanfare, just the white of his cassock blending with the pale gravel of the footpath. Elias waited 10 seconds, then followed. They said Leo had lived simply back in Brazil, carried his own bags, cooked his own meals, washed his own vestments. Here, in the heart of the Vatican, those habits hadn't changed. Elias had watched him the night before gently wipe his shoes on a towel left at the entrance to the gardens. Tonight, the Pope walked slowly, hands clasped behind his back. He stopped often, once to look up at the moon, once to examine the bark of a cypress. Elias followed in silence, always just out of sight when Leo turned a corner, always visible if the Pope chose to look back. He never did. Halfway through the circuit, Elias noticed a change. Leo wasn't following the usual route. Instead of curving left toward the reflecting pool, he veered right, toward the old stone wall near the laundry quarters, a part of the garden rarely visited. It had no view, no flowers, just storage and shadow. Elias followed more slowly now, ears tuned to every footfall. He watched the Pope pause by a rusted service door built into the side of an ivy-covered outbuilding. Leo took a key from his pocket, unlocked the door, and disappeared inside without hesitation. Elias stepped forward, carefully. No weapons drawn, just presence. The door hadn't fully latched behind the Pope. Through the narrow gap, Elias saw only shapes and dim yellow light, walls lined with old wood cabinets, an institutional sink, a stack of folded aprons. And then he heard laughter. Not loud, not mocking, just warm, natural laughter. A woman's voice, raspy with age. "You walk like your shoes still don't fit." Then Leo's voice. "They don't. I never broke them in, just like the Curia." Elias moved no closer. He could make out the scene now. The Pope was seated on a low stool beside an elderly nun, her hands wrinkled and slow as she folded linens from a massive wicker basket. She was blind, that much was clear. Her eyes drifted, but did not settle. "You used to sit here even before you were anyone," she said. Leo nodded. "And you used to pretend not to recognize me." "I still don't," she smirked. He laughed. Elias stepped back. He felt like he'd trespassed. Not on space, but on something holier. something not meant for guards or cardinals, or even the cameras that lined St. Peter's Dome. When the Pope finally emerged 10 minutes later, Elias had resumed his distance. Leo walked past him, gave no glance, no comment. But Elias saw it now, what he hadn't before. The Pope wasn't wandering aimlessly. He was returning to the only place in the Vatican where he had once been anonymous. And the woman? She wasn't forgotten. She was remembered by a man the world thought was too loud, doing something no one else was meant to see. Elias said nothing, but that night, for the first time, he didn't write in his notebook. Because this, whatever this was, couldn't be reduced to bullet points. It was the 7th night. The schedule was unchanged. The air was cooler now, clearer too. The May breeze carried the scent of cypress and clove from the nearby hedges. The moon hung just above the basilica's dome like a suspended breath. Elias waited near the gate again, punctual to the second. But this time, when Pope Leo emerged from the passage, he didn't walk alone. He stopped at the first stone step, adjusted his sleeves, then looked directly at Elias and said, "Come." Elias hesitated. He had never walked beside a pope, not like this, not off-duty, unarmoured in purpose. Still he followed. They walked side by side, not quite matching pace. Leo's stride was relaxed, loose. Elias remained measured. They said nothing for nearly 2 full laps of the garden perimeter. It was Pope Leo who broke the silence. "You don't trust me," he said plainly. Elias didn't answer right away. Then, "I trust the office." Leo nodded, as if expecting that. "But not the man inside it." Another pause. Elias glanced ahead. "You act outside tradition." "I follow a different one," Leo replied, "older than lace and bells." They passed a line of olive trees, the branches rustling faintly like whispered Latin. Leo continued, "I don't expect applause, but I do expect resistance. It's how I know I'm not just performing." Elias stopped walking. Leo stopped too. "Why me?" Elias asked. Not sharply, just a genuine question. Leo met his eyes. "Because I know what it means to be skeptical, to carry duty like armour, and to see grace as weakness." He turned toward the fountain. "When I was a priest in Sao Paulo, I visited a prison every Friday. Same faces, same silence. There was one guard, like you. Never smiled, always watched. The others thought he hated me. One day, he asked if I wanted to know why he stared so much. Leo smiled faintly. He said, "Because if you were lying, someone needed to notice." He looked back at Elias. "I don't mind being watched. I mind being dismissed." Elias lowered his gaze. He didn't feel corrected. He felt recognized. "I saw you with the nun," he said quietly. Leo didn't react. "Rosaria. She's 91. Was losing her sight when I was just a visiting bishop. She let me hide in the laundry room to avoid the curial delegates." Elias tilted his head. "You hide often?" Leo shrugged. "Sometimes grace doesn't survive pageantry." They resumed walking. No more words passed between them for several minutes. As they approached the cloister wall, Leo paused once more. His hand brushed the stone absently. "You've served this place longer than I've been allowed inside its heart," he said, "and I'm not asking for your affection. I'm asking for your attention." Elias nodded once, then softly, "If I still believe you don't belong here." "Tell them," Leo said, "but do it honestly." He stepped away, heading down the stone path alone, the white of his robe vanishing into garden shadow. Elias stood still, his hands at his sides, unsure whether what had just happened was a confrontation, a confession, or something far more disarming. That night, Elias didn't return to his journal. He retrieved a sheet of fresh parchment instead. For the first time in years, he wrote not as a guard, but as a man who had just seen a truth the world would never put in a headline. And that, he realized, was precisely why it mattered. The parchment sat on Elias's desk for nearly an hour before he began. He didn't have the words at first. That was rare. Usually clarity arrived quickly. Observations, dates, behaviors, all noted with military neatness. But this time was different. This wasn't routine. This wasn't duty. This was witness. He didn't address it formally. No title, no salutation. Just a date at the top. May 15th, 2025, 3 days before the inauguration. He began slowly. Over the past 6 nights, I've followed the Holy Father on his unscheduled walks through the Vatican gardens. I was instructed to observe, nothing more. He kept his handwriting sharp and uniform, just like formation. What I witnessed was not irregularity, it was reverence. He paused, looked at the sentence, considered crossing it out. Did he mean that? He did, he continued. On multiple occasions, Pope Leo XIV departed from the established footpath to visit lesser-used quarters of the Vatican. These deviations were undocumented. At first, I believed them to be breaches of order. I now believe they are acts of intention. He described the visits to the old laundry wing, the quiet meeting with Sister Rosaria, the memory shared, the gratitude expressed. But he didn't dramatize it. No embellishment, no emotion, just facts. No aides were present, no press, no recording devices. These actions were private, unscripted, and unrehearsed. They carried no agenda I could perceive, only recognition. Then he wrote the line that would matter most. In my years of service, I have seen many leaders honor the Church, but this is the first time I have seen a pope seek out those the Church forgot. He signed only his last name, Mäder. No rank, no seal, just ink and witness. When he folded the letter, he slipped it into a blank envelope and left it at the commander's desk, late enough that no one would see him. No conversation, no explanation. He knew what it was. It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't praise. And it was the kind of report that didn't fit protocol because it documented what protocol usually ignored. And he knew what would happen next. They'd read it, quietly. They'd pass it through unspoken channels, and then they'd bury it. Not maliciously, just routinely. Because things like this didn't belong in official logs. They couldn't be filed under risk or doctrine or incident. They'd disappear into a drawer under a folder labelled non-actionable. But that didn't matter, because he had written it, because someone had to. The next morning there was no mention of the report, no summons, no acknowledgement. At formation, Commander Albrecht passed Elias without a glance. But Elias didn't need a response. He wasn't trying to be heard. He was trying to record something before the Vatican reshaped it into silence. In the guard barracks, someone joked that Pope Leo had skipped another rehearsal. Another said he'd heard the new papal shoes were second-hand. Elias didn't respond. He just polished his halberd, aligned the blade with the edge of his desk, and breathed. He didn't feel converted, or softened, or inspired. He just felt, finally, like he had done something worthy of the uniform. And in a place where every movement is choreographed, that was more defiant than any step forward. Elias expected a summons the next day. Not public, not formal, just a knock at his door, a quiet word from a superior. A transfer slip slipped under his tray at breakfast. That's how it usually worked in the Vatican, when someone stepped outside the lines, not as punishment, but as preservation. But the knock never came. Instead, morning broke with the same hymn echoing down the marble corridor, the same smell of beeswax and linen in the vesting room, the same sound of boots against stone as the guard assembled for their routine briefing. And when Commander Albrecht entered the hall, he did not look at Elias. He simply called the orders, rotations, stations, inauguration readiness drills. Elias stood in line, helmet in hand, and waited. When the meeting ended, Albrecht approached, but said nothing of the report. Only one word as he passed Elias: acknowledged. That was it. No reprimand, no commendation, no note in his file. But Elias understood. The report had reached the desk it was meant for, and then it was quietly folded, perhaps scanned and set aside, into one of the hundreds of archival drawers meant to keep inconvenient truths safely preserved but functionally invisible. There would be no discussion about the Pope kneeling in the laundry wing, no Vatican press office statement clarifying his unscheduled visits, no entry in the record about the Pope's late-night walks among nuns and janitors and gardeners. That part of Leo XIV's story would not be told, because it did not fit. Not the papal image being managed, not the version of him the Curia was building. Humble, yes, but orderly. Accessible, but not unorthodox. Friendly, but not unpredictable. The real Leo, the one who whispered prayers into dark hallways and kissed the hands of forgotten sisters, was not part of the brochure. And so, the report would be buried, not destroyed, not denied, just filed away in a drawer under a label like internal reflection. Still, Elias felt no bitterness, because silence was not erasure, and the truth, once seen, had already done its work. That evening, as Elias stood post outside the bronze doors of the Apostolic Palace, he noticed a change. Pope Leo passed by on his way to an unlisted meeting. His cassock fluttered slightly in the breeze. For a moment their eyes met. There was no nod, no signal, just recognition. As if both men now carried the same quiet secret between them. And maybe that was enough. In the barracks that night, the young guard Stein asked a question while folding his belt. "Hey, Mäder, you believe in this guy yet?" Elias didn't answer at first. Then, calmly, "I believe in what I saw." Stein chuckled. "That's the closest thing to praise you've ever said." Elias said nothing more, because it wasn't praise and it wasn't loyalty, it was witness. The next day, preparations for the papal inauguration accelerated. Guards drilled on formation angles. Brass fittings were polished. New cassocks were issued. Everything was moving again, like a great clock resuming after a moment's pause. And Elias? He took his place without hesitation. No reassignment, no reduction in rank, no disciplinary notation. But something had shifted, not on paper, inside, because the church might control what gets remembered, but it cannot unsee what has been seen. May 17th arrived without announcement. No bells, no fanfare. Just the slow, steady tick of Vatican clocks, marking the final full day before Pope Leo XIV's formal inauguration. The city outside the walls buzzed with pilgrims and press, but within the barracks everything moved with studied calm. Uniforms were checked, halberds were oiled, formations rehearsed. It was not celebration, it was preparation. Elias moved through it all as he always had, silent, exact, detached. But inside him, something had settled, not softened, settled. That morning, he rose early, before Reveille. The stone corridors were still cool with night air as he made his way to the small chapel near the guard armory. It was always empty this early. He sat in the rear pew, hands clasped, eyes forward. He didn't pray. Not exactly. He just listened to the absence of noise, to the silence between footsteps, to the echo of stone, remembering who had walked there before him. Then he returned to his quarters. His ledger sat on the shelf, between a spare glove and a cracked wooden rosary he never used. He opened it carefully, flipped past the earlier entries, duty logs, night reports, gear tallies. He found the page marked with a thread. Blank. He picked up his pen and wrote a single line. May 17th, saw something holy. No one else was looking. Then he closed the book. He didn't file the page, didn't lock it away. just placed it back on the shelf as it was. Let it exist. By midday, he was back in full dress, his posture exact, helmet under one arm. As he stood in the outer courtyard, the younger recruits whispered about the coming ceremony. One worried about sun glare. Another asked whether Leo would wear the red mozzetta or skip it entirely, as he'd hinted. Stein, elbowing his way past, nudged Elias lightly. "You think he'll smile during the procession?" Elias didn't answer, but something flickered behind his eyes. Something unreadable. Not amusement. Not doubt. Just memory. By evening, the final pre-inauguration briefing was complete. Elias wasn't selected for inner platform formation. He hadn't expected to be. Instead, he was assigned to second-tier perimeter, visible to the crowd but not directly involved in the central procession. He didn't mind. He didn't need a place at the center. He had already seen what mattered, and it hadn't happened under lights or within camera frames. It had happened beside an old nun, in a hallway no one polished, with hands most had forgotten. It had happened with no witness but him. And maybe that was the point. Later that night, as the sun dipped below the Vatican walls, Elias returned briefly to the gardens. Not to patrol, not on assignment, just to pass through. He walked alone, helmet in hand, along the gravel path between the fountain and the cloister arch. At the far end of the walk, near the bench where Pope Leo had once left him a folded note, Elias paused. He looked down at the base of the stone bench, saw the same hairline crack in the marble, slipped a tiny folded scrap of parchment into the space beneath it. No signature, no message, just presence. Then he turned and walked away without a sound. Was Elias right to keep what he witnessed quiet? If you were in his place, seeing something beautiful the Vatican chose not to share, would you have stayed silent too? And do small, hidden acts of compassion matter more than grand public gestures? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button and tap the bell so you never miss our next tale. We post every single day. Share this with someone who still believes that the most powerful truths often go unspoken. Check out our other stories now appearing on your screen. And we'll see you tomorrow, same time, with another unforgettable tale.